Welcome to NAPABA Coffee House, presented by NAPABA, the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, in collaboration with the Harvard Law School Center on the Legal Profession. My name is Genevieve Antono. I am in the Harvard Law School class of 2022, and I'm absolutely delighted to be producing NAPABA Coffee House as part of my student fellowship project with the Harvard Law School Center on the Legal Profession. In today's episode, episode 2, you will hear a one-on-one conversation between our host, Larry Tu, and our guest, John Chou, who is the special advisor to the chairman and CEO at AmerisourceBergen. AmerisourceBergen is one of the top 10 companies in the Fortune 500, and it is one of the largest global pharmaceutical sourcing and distribution services companies. So imagine programs and services in the pharmaceutical supply chain connecting healthcare providers and biotech and pharmaceutical manufacturers on the one hand to patients who need access to those products on the other hand. John and Larry are some of the most prominent and respected lawyers and C-suite executives in corporate America. As I just mentioned, John is the special advisor to the chairman and CEO at a Fortune top 10 company, and he used to serve as their chief legal officer. And many of you are familiar with the host of our show, Larry Tu, who retired from CBS Corporation in 2020, but before that was the Chief Legal Officer at CBS, the GC at Dell, the GC at NBC Universal, the GC for the APAC region, for Goldman Sachs, partner at a major law firm, and so much more. One of the goals of NAPABA Coffee House is to serve as a resource to a wide range of people. So whether that is, the in-house counsel who is in the pipeline to becoming a GC, or the law and pre-law student who's just starting out their careers. And I will be honest, behind the scenes here at NAPABA Coffee House, sometimes we wonder whether some of our guests are so successful that they will seem a bit too far away from the most junior members of our audience. But as I was reviewing this interview, and I'm recording this intro after the fact, I realized that there's actually a lot that a very junior person like myself has to learn from this interview. So I will share 2 of my takeaways with you. First, Larry and John are very self-aware. They're very humble and they have a learner's mindset. And over the course of this interview, you will hear them say things like, yes, I used to make this mistake a lot more when I was younger. I'm better at it now, but once in a while I still, struggle with it. And I think that this is a really great lesson for very junior people, for law students to learn. Because if these very successful C-suite executives can say, yes, I am still learning, I am still growing, what more for us, right? We don't have to pretend that we're perfect and we have it all together. We can be a lot more transparent about the fact that we are still learning and growing. And second, even though Larry and John are very humble, that's not the same thing as underplaying your own talents and achievements. So over the course of this interview, you will find that they're both very confident in a very understated way in what they bring to the table. So you will hear things like, oh, even when I was a junior associate, I didn't like to do things without knowing the why, or people respected me because I didn't hesitate to, call out a lack of common sense. And I think this is something that maybe women and especially people who struggle with imposter syndrome can learn from, because they're such great models for showing us that, yes, you can be confident and humble. And yes, you can be confident and have a learner's mindset. Those were some of my takeaways, and we want to hear what some of your takeaways are. So please leave a comment below, or leave a comment on our LinkedIn page at linkedin.com/company/NAPABA Coffee House. All right, without further ado, here is Larry and John.
So John, thank you for joining our coffee house sessions. You and I have gotten to know each other over the years through various NAPABA events. You have an amazing and distinguished legal career, and so I want to thank you for spending time with us today. So why don't we start really at the very beginning. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing, your parents, where you grew up, early schooling, just to paint that picture for us and give us a flavor of your early years in life before law school.
Sure. Well, my parents came to the U.S. right after World War II. from China. They were each from wealthy and fairly prominent families in China. And at that time, right after World War II, the government or different provincial governments were sending students to study in the US, to study subjects like engineering or other technical subjects, with the idea that they would eventually return to China to help rebuild the country post-World War II. In the case of my parents, and actually a lot of folks similarly situated, they were sent to state universities in the Midwest. So my parents actually ended up at the University of Minnesota, and they met there. They were from different parts of China. My mother was from Beijing, and my father was from a southwestern province, Yunnan province. There were a number of Chinese students there, all sent by the government, and that's where they met.
So is that where you grew up in Minnesota? Is that where you went to?
I didn't. So they were in Minnesota. This was in the late 40s, and they planned to go back to China. In 1949, the Communist Revolution took place, and a lot of the Chinese students who were in the U.S. decided to stay and sort of see what was happening, because they were hearing from their families at home, that things were not great for people from wealthy families. And so a lot of them just stayed sort of waiting to see what would happen. And then actually, interestingly, the McCarthy era took place. And at one point in the 50s, early 50s, it was not possible for them to go back. And eventually they decided to stay in the US. They moved to New York. And that's where I was born, in New York. And I grew up in New York and Queens initially, and then eventually in a northern New Jersey suburb, Bergen County, called Teaneck. And I was sort of thinking in preparation for this conversation with you, thinking back, that I actually, when I think about it, had a pretty comfortable growing up. I was lucky. I grew up in a town that had a very sophisticated population. There were a lot of Jewish families where one or another parent was an academic at a university in New York or in New Jersey. And so, for someone who was being driven by my parents to be very studious, it was sort of an environment where that was okay. It was okay to be smart. And
so you were surrounded by smart, studious people driven by similar parents.
Yeah, well, probably my parents were more extreme than others, but definitely an achievement-oriented, academically oriented suburb. So that I think back, if I had moved to a place where the football team was the key to life in school, it potentially would have been a very different existence. But
or maybe you would have been the starring tight end on the football team. Who knows? I mean, I wouldn't rule that out.
Who knows? Right? That could be.
It's interesting because your family's history is so similar to mine. With very few changes. Mm-hmm. Even the time period is so similar in terms of when my parents come over. It's just remarkable that many of us have quite similar backgrounds. I mean, not all of us do, but many of us have overlapping backgrounds.
Yeah, I actually think a lot of us, especially of Chinese descent, who are of sort of this age, mid 60s, do have a very similar background. Yeah. Because that's sort of that group of Chinese who came to the U.S. post World War II was very similar.
So I'm going to skip ahead to college because I know you and I chatted before we did this. Your college major was biochemistry. And to me, that screams pre-med. All of my friends in college who studied major there in biochemistry, went to med school. I was not smart enough to take biochem, so I took a different path. So my question for you was, what happened to you on the way to medical school? How did you get detoured?
Yeah, it's actually sort of a circuitous story, but I actually was really pushed into biochemistry, and I've actually heard other people describe sort of similar situations with parental pressure, and it's definitely a theme in my life, responding to parental pressure and trying to fight against it to some degree, but not totally. When I started college, what I really wanted to do was major in English, because at the time I thought I wanted to be a writer, a creative writer. Actually, that was my dream. And in the summer between my freshman and sophomore year, I pronounced to my parents that I was going to major in English, and they had sort of a meltdown.
So all
And
hell broke loose.
it was basically a summer of lecturing about how there are no jobs if you major in English, and they actually enlisted their friends to lecture at me. And ultimately, I just after a summer of constant haranguing, I ended up caving in, and I ended up majoring in biochemistry. But I sort of ended up just doing the minimum that I could do to get to fulfill the requirements, and took a lot of literature. And then ultimately, in my senior year, I was fortunate to get a fellowship, a traveling fellowship that in the fall, that allowed me to travel post college. And so at that point, I decided to not take the MCATs, and with the idea that, well, I've got this fellowship, so I can do other things. You should still be proud of me.
So you had to leave the country to avoid taking the MCATs. That's what it comes
Exactly,
down to.
exactly,
Okay.
exactly.
And then you got a job, I think, as a copy editor at Asia Week, which was, I guess, sort of aligned with your writing interests, although not maybe creative writing. And then you were a loan officer at a bank before you
Yeah,
ended up in law school. So was
yeah.
that something else you tried out?
Well, I went overseas. I was a year in the Philippines, and then spent a year in Hong Kong working as a journalist for a magazine there, as a copy editor. And I ended up I really loved the experience. It was actually the first time I'd ever been in a situation where where I was part of the majority. So that was actually for me a really interesting experience, having always been in situations where um, I was part of a very small group. At the time that we were in college, as you will recall, I mean, there were very, very few Asian Americans in college at the time. So for me, it was a great experience, and I actually wanted to stay, but then I felt like I needed to get back to the U.S. So I came back. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I was looking for newspaper jobs, but at the time, it's interesting to think about now, when not that many people actually want to work for a newspaper. It's
Yeah.
not necessarily the most a career that has great prospects. But at the time, it was very, very competitive and hard to do. So I didn't really have a clear view, and I ended up getting into a bank training program for what was then Chemical Bank, which subsequently merged with Chase Manhattan Bank, and eventually with JP Morgan. So it was sort of the precursor to JP Morgan. And I started doing that. I actually liked it. I like numbers. I'm good at numbers. It was international banking. It seemed pretty interesting. But my parents were, again, entered into the fray, and were very worked up, because they said, well, how can you can't just go through life with just a college degree. No one will respect you if you don't have a higher degree. You have to have a higher degree. You know, if you want to get married, people only like families only want their son-in-law to have some sort of a D. They would joke, you have to have a PhD or an MD. You have to have some sort of D. How can you function without?
Oh, I thought they meant like a grade D in a class or something.
That I should have responded that way, exactly. But ultimately, again, sort of months and months of pressuring. You've got to do something. You've got to do something. So I ended up taking the LSATs because I read articles that said, well, if you don't really know what you want to do, if you want sort of to have flexibility to do anything, then go to law school. And that so that's sort of how I ended up in law school.
You sort of backed your way into law school almost as a compromise concession.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then lo and behold, you end up being general counsel of a major corporation, for many, many years, a stellar, successful career. So tell us a little bit about the role that you're in and that you're in the middle of transitioning from.
Yeah, so I've been either the general counsel or the chief legal officer of a company called AmerisourceBergen, which is a large pharmaceutical distribution and services company. I've been with the company since 2002 and the general counsel or chief legal officer since 2007. In September of last year, of 2021, I started a planned succession. And so I passed on the chief legal officer role to someone who I had been developing to take over from me. And that was really great to see her step into the role. And then I agreed to stay on for a number of months to help with her transition. We had also just completed a large European acquisition. So I agreed to stay on to help manage the European legal team for a period of time and help with integration activities. So I'm doing that now. It's been a lot of fun to get to know a new group of folks. I have to get up very early in the morning to have calls on European time, but aside from that, it's been great. And I'll be doing that through the end of April or so.
That's
and
great,
then
yeah.
I'll be off to retirement, which I'm also looking forward to.
Well, I want to come back in a minute to your incredibly long tenure at the company, which is somewhat unusual, but certainly not completely atypical. But it's an interesting career path, and I want to talk more about that later. But before we do that, after law school, you went to law firms for a couple of stints, and then from there you took your first in-house role and did that for a bit, and then went back to law practice before you landed in the current role that you're in, or the company that you're with. So tell me about what stands out about those early years as an associate. What do you recall about that, good and bad?
Yeah, I think what I recall is that I really disliked being an associate at a law firm. I worked for large New York and Philadelphia law firms. I think that there's a part of me that doesn't like to be told what to do for irrational reasons. So, when you think about the culture of law firms,
did it remind you of your parents?
It definitely reminded me of my parents. You have to be here at Saturday morning. Well, why? Because I'm someone who's always asking why and sort of questioning things. No reason why, you just have to be there. Because we want you to, and just wait until we get there and we'll tell you what to do. So I think the overall environment to me was not, didn't really take into account the fact that, people are smart, people should contribute, and that in some ways, how you lead a group, you should, instead of ordering people what to do, you should be trying to explain to them why they need to do what they need to do, and why it's important to do X, Y, or Z. So in some ways, that experience actually really influenced how I think about leadership, because for me, at least, the experience was just very hierarchical. Do what you're told, don't question. And from my standpoint, that just is not necessarily the best way to get, certainly wasn't the best way to get the best out of me. And from my standpoint, I think that's something that I've always reacted against a little bit as I went forward into the future. So it was a short period of time, but I think in some ways, in a weirdly reactive way, it really was influential in how I think about leadership, because it sort of represented exactly what I didn't want to do and what I tried to avoid in my own style.
Now, from there, you had a couple of in-house roles at two major corporations, including a stint, I think, overseas again, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, did you find that in those contexts, this issue of hierarchy and kind of being ordered around and not being given explanations for or reasons for doing X, Y, or Z, was that all that different necessarily? I mean, is there such a huge contrast necessarily between in-house environments and law firms on that issue?
I think it depends on the culture of the company. But I think that, I found that maybe because law in a company is a support function. So you're not generating the profits, you're having to do what needs to be done to help the business get done. In some ways, it doesn't lend itself quite as much to a situation where the leaders in the legal department can just dictate to people what to do. I mean, typically, as I think all of us who have led legal departments experience, we're generally short-staffed just because we're a cost center, and so we have to be pragmatic in what we have our people do and how we have them utilize their time. I think that the one thing that I did carry over was that I was always someone who liked people who had common sense, and if people didn't exercise common sense, I was sort of the one who behind the scenes would be calling it out. And for whatever reason, that seemed to be something that attracted people to me, that they felt comfortable with someone who was confident enough to sort of call out, people acting like jerks, or calling out people that were behaving in ways that didn't make any sense, or someone who was willing ultimately to just ask questions that seemed stupid, but actually were not that stupid, because actually sometimes the person making the comment didn't really know what they were talking about.
Now, let's dwell on that for a minute, because I think you've said to me in other conversations that you view yourself as a nonconformist. Mm-hmm. Is this part of what you mean, that you sort of ask, you probe, you don't necessarily take things at face value?
I think that's definitely part of it. I think that I've always had this desire to be a bit of a rebel, but I think the reality is that that's not true. The reality is that I've always ended up to some degree conforming. But I think in some ways that tension is useful, because as a lawyer, in that I'm rebellious enough to want to call things out and challenge things, but ultimately also as a lawyer, you've got to make sure that things get done. You've got to be pretty diligent. So I think actually I was sort of thinking about this again before our conversation, that in a peculiar way, it's sort of helpful for a lawyer to have a little bit of both. But again, that's one of those things, your idea of yourself and the reality sometimes is a little bit differentiated. And so I always like to think of myself as a rebel, but again, when I think about it, I probably haven't been ultimately that rebellious.
Well, a rebel wearing the robes of a corporate general counsel.
Exactly.
I like that.
There you go.
Well, so what I find curious is that in the next phase of your career, you went back to a law firm. And so now, instead of being an associate, you are commanding an army of associates. So, how did the law firm world look differently to you from that vantage point? Or did it?
It definitely looked a lot different to me. I think one thing I hadn't realized as an associate is the pressure that partners have to market and to bring in business. And I actually over the years like the technical part of lawyering. I like the challenges that came with different problems that lawyers have to deal with. But I definitely found that I didn't enjoy the marketing aspects. And as a partner in a law firm, marketing is a constant. You just have to be out there trying to get the business because as a partner, um, that's part of your role, that's part of your job. And if you're going to have any influence and meaningful role within a firm, at least from my standpoint, the last thing you want to do is sort of be I call it a working partner, which is fine. There are some excellent working partners, but you want to be able to control your destiny, and to do that, you really have to bring in business and have a book of business. And to do that means that not only are you working, but in all of your off hours, you're spending time marketing and pitching and just trying to bring in business. And you never know the next day when you finish a project, where's your next project going to come from? So I think it's actually a pretty tough existence, and it gave me a lot of appreciation, I think, for what lawyers in law firms have to do.
So let's fast forward to your AmerisourceBergen role. I think you went to the company in '02 or something like that, and
Mhm.
then after 4 or 5 years became the general counsel, and you stayed in that role for 15 years or so, and you're still in the role today. Um, I imagine being general counsel is a very different role than either being an associate in a law firm or even being being a partner. Um, and I'm curious, as you look at the role and as you grew into it over the years, what parts of it came naturally to you? And what parts of it you might have actually struggled with and had to work harder at to be successful?
That's actually a really interesting question. I think for me, a lot of the um, activities that a general counsel has to do came pretty comfortably to me. I think one of the main things a general counsel needs to do is also be a business executive, as well as a lawyer. And since it was never really my dream to be a lawyer, I really like doing other things. Becoming the general counsel was a way for me to expand what I was able to do and expand my activities beyond just purely legal areas of activity. So I was able to be very involved in strategy, be very involved in um, critical business issues that came up. And actually, during the course of my career, I took on different roles. I think in part because I just was interested in a variety of areas. So at various times, I had the strategy group under me. I had the IT group under
Hmm.
me a couple of times, which it's fairly unusual for IT to be under the general counsel. Usually, it's if it's under an executive, it's usually under the CFO or some executive that sort. But I was just interested in a lot of areas. I developed a reputation where people didn't think of me as just a lawyer, and for me that was good. It was gave me the chance to expand my horizons, the chance to do a lot of things.
So, John, let me interject there for a second because earlier when you were talking about your stint as a law firm partner, one of the things you said was that the marketing part of it wasn't necessarily your favorite cup of tea, but you really like the technical aspects of being a
Mm.
lawyer. But it sounds like in the GC role that becomes less and less a part of your day.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
in some respects, you were moving away from the thing that you like the best about law practice. And so talk about that because
yeah,
clearly there
yeah.
were other things that were filling up your time and it required broader skills than just being a technically competent or even proficient lawyer.
I should say that I think as a lawyer, um, I've always thought it was important to be a technically sound lawyer. I think it's helpful, even as a general counsel, to have a good grounding technically, to be technically competent. That being said, from just a personal interest standpoint, I'm interested in law, but I've always been interested in a lot of other areas, and strategy and business are definitely areas that I've always been interested in. So um, I would distinguish that from marketing, because to me, marketing is sort of, I've never honestly been someone who I think could be a great salesperson in the sense of going out and just, calling on people and asking for their business. But I am someone who can go out and engage with people in conversations about business, about what they do, and try to understand what they do, and help them, help direct them
Yeah.
in a useful way.
But let me probe on that a little, because it seems to me that part of your success in the career that you've had also involves selling yourself.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, I know that's a different kind of sales
Yeah,
activity, but you're
yeah,
still having to pitch yourself and put yourself forward and, deal with tough situations and tough colleagues. And so, talk about that part of the kind of recipe for success. How do you sell and promote yourself into
yeah,
these roles?
yeah. No, absolutely. I think in order to rise up in any organization, I mean, it's true of a law firm too, but in a corporate setting, you have to have good interpersonal skills. I think that I've always had good interpersonal skills. Maybe it was because just growing up, I always wanted to try to fit in. I never wanted to stand out. I think that's probably an emotion that a lot of Asian Americans generally have growing up, and
This is
Asian
even though
American,
this is even though you are a nonconformist.
even though I was a nonconformist. But exactly. See, I'm very contradictory. So you're
Yes.
catching me in all the contradictions. I think having good interpersonal skills is critical. I think that networking is really critical, and sort of gaining advocates for you and for your career is critical. I think one thing that that's been really important to me is to network sort of without regard to hierarchy. So I have in my network, I have people who are very senior, but I also have people who are in the ranks at various levels, because what I found is that um, you really need people at all levels to help you. People are giving you information, and that can be helpful. People are advocating for your career, and that can be helpful. And ultimately, I have I'll call it a shtick where I like to think of myself as being someone who doesn't like to toot my own horn, but on the other hand, um, I was actually thinking about that also ahead of this conversation, and I think that's one of these mythologies that I tell myself. But ultimately, I'm also out there pitching myself. It's just that part of my pitch is that I'm not pitching myself.
Clearly, you found a way to toot your horn without tooting it in a way that
Yeah,
you might not have found appealing, but
yeah.
it was nonetheless very effective.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think it's definitely something that people coming up need to think about. How do you toot your own horn? How do you build your reputation, and your sort of your advocates for you and your career? But you've got to do it in a way that you feel comfortable.
I want to go to part B of my question, which is, so what parts of being a general counsel did not come easily to you, that you even struggled with from time to time and had to learn, kind of skills, or learn how to break, old habits that might not have been the most productive to become more effective?
Delegation, delegating well, I would say. I think that I tend to have strong views about how things should be done. And it definitely took me a while to reach the point where I felt comfortable letting go and sort of acknowledging that first, that different people are going to do things different ways, that there's no necessarily one right way to do something, and that, you know, if people substantively are doing things right, the fact that they might do not proceed along exactly the way I would do it also is fine, because different people are different and need to move forward in different ways and need to manage people and manage projects in different ways. And just because it's different from how I would do it, you know, I shouldn't be uncomfortable. I need to allow people to allow people to develop. You really have to have confidence, show them that you have confidence if they're getting things done, and allow them to do it in their own way.
Yeah, as you look back, I mean, did you think were there situations where on that issue you made mistakes earlier in your career that you learned from it? Because I certainly did, and I know exactly what you're talking about. I think many of us have the tendency, especially earlier in our careers, to micromanage other people
Yeah,
too much.
yeah,
And it
yeah,
takes a while to figure that out and to even to realize that about yourself.
yeah. No, I think definitely so. Exactly, micromanaging is the perfect word for it, and sort of jumping um, in a way that just demotivates people. And you know, I definitely have done that in especially, you know, early on. And you know, it's not good on two fronts. It demotivates the person, and then you basically are pulling work onto your plate because basically you've sort of said, "Well, I'm going to do it because I've got to do it this way," and it's actually the worst of all possible worlds.
I mean, do you find, John, that on things like that where we have certain natural tendencies that may not be the most helpful, that we sort of have a natural default setting and then we will relapse? And you got to remind yourself over and over again these lessons that are learned, but you never completely escape from it.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think self-awareness is very important. I think knowing your strengths and weaknesses, knowing your tendencies, like you say, and then, you know, constantly thinking about it. But it doesn't mean you don't relapse. I mean, even now, as I'm approaching retirement, I still relapse, you know, from time to time, and it's hard, you know, to sometimes to control yourself, because I think when things get um, under pressure, you know, that's when you especially have to sort of force yourself to step back and make sure you're not doing things that are not beneficial for the team.
Well, John, I'm going to throw a couple of propositions at you, and I want you to react to them, yes or no, or agree or disagree, and we could talk about them briefly, and then I think we'll be close to finishing. So, what do you think about this statement? To be an effective GC, you have to work to become the smartest person in the room.
That I definitely disagree.
So why do you disagree?
I think that goes to this issue of micromanaging and demotivating. I think what I found over time is that it's actually um, great to have smarter people than you on your team. I mean, and you really hope that you have smarter people on the team. I think that the person in charge, this is just my own personal view, needs to be smart enough. You need to understand. You need to be able to understand what's going on and understand what people are explaining. But you know, ultimately, you hope that there are people who are smarter than you. You're not going to be, the scope of a general counsel's job is so broad. There's no way for you to be the ultimate expert in everything. And there might be one particular topic area where you know the most, but there are going to be a lot of topic areas where you need to rely on other people. So for me, you know, the idea that you can be the smartest person in the room is not a good thing. And then I think on top of it, it's not good because it actually doesn't promote confidence in your own people. I think if they feel like they're working for someone who's always going to try to show that he or she is smarter than them, That's just a really, I think, a negative atmosphere and a negative mindset that you're creating for your folks.
Yeah, I could not agree with you more. Let me try one more on you, and then we're going to wrap this up. So you spoke earlier about leadership. Um, so what about the statement, leadership and management skills are important, but they're overrated? Just hire great people and you're all set.
That I definitely disagree with. Um, I think especially with what I found, the population of lawyers, lawyers are often very smart, um, but certainly some of the lawyers that I've hired, have needed um, guidance in terms of how to develop some of these soft skills that I talked about, the interpersonal skills, sort of self-awareness, how to lead, sort of understanding the culture of a company. And I think oftentimes lawyers come in having the mindset of wanting to be the smartest people in the room. And then you're in a company, you may be smarter than some of the salespeople, but they probably know a lot more than you about business and strategy. And so, how you work together, how you develop productive relationships is really critical. So I think that's where management and focus on development is really important, because you sort of bring in people with the raw materials, but I think a lot of people need some guidance and push towards developing some of these other skills that are critical to their success.
John, you're about to take a step into the next chapter of your life. So as you walk out the door, what's the thing you're going to miss the most about the role that you've been playing in this company?
I think what I'm going to miss the most is working with people, both in my department and outside of the department. You spend so much time at work. You are fortunate if it's a situation where you really enjoy the people that you're working with. And I've been fortunate to have a situation where I've enjoyed the people I work with, where I like them, and I know that they like me as well. I think that I've tried to embody a sort of servant leadership style of leadership that I think a lot of people at my company have gravitated towards and try to emulate a little bit. And I think that's a great thing, because I think what you really want to do is eventually develop people who you're really proud to see rise up. And I'll definitely miss all these people, but I think I'll be able to stay in touch with them because we have good relations, which again, I'll miss that, but at the same time, they'll keep me advised of how they're doing. And it'll be, I think, great to see from afar how they progress and how they achieve and succeed.
Well, and it seems very clear to me that you left the company in great hands with the way that you've led the team. So congratulations to you, and thank you very much for your time. And with that, we'll wrap it up.
Thanks, Larry. This was really a fun conversation. We'll have to do it again sometime.
Thank you. Thank you.